before the Book of Enoch named them, before scribes in Qumran copied their descent onto parchment, before the 200 swore their oath on Mount Hermon, there were whispers, fragments older than the canonical fall, rumors embedded in Persian starlight and Babylonian clay, stories that speak not of a single transgression, but of conflicts already ancient when the Watchers first turned their gaze earthward. In the caves above the Dead Sea, among scrolls predating the Christian era by centuries, scholars found something unsettling. References to celestial beings in discord, allusions to wars in heaven that existed before the Watcher narrative took its familiar shape. Divine councils fractured by tensions whose origins stretched beyond textual memory. The Hebrew phrase B'nai Elohim, sons of God, appears in contexts that predate Enoch. In Job, these beings present themselves before Yahweh. Among them stands the Satan, not yet singular adversary, but council member, prosecutor, angel, whose function involves testing. This council implies differentiation, hierarchy, distinct roles, distinct perspectives, distinct wills. And wherever hierarchy exists, among beings of intelligence, tension follows. The Watcher's fall was not the beginning of cosmic discord. It was an echo of something far older, a rupture in the heavenly architecture that no surviving scripture fully names. This is the cosmology that existed in shadow. The angelic wars before Enoch, the forgotten metaphysics of heaven's first fracture. The Book of Enoch tells a relatively straightforward story. 200 angels descended. They taught forbidden knowledge. They mingled with humanity. They produced the Nephilim. For this transgression, they were bound beneath the desert until final judgment. But this narrative did not emerge from vacuum. The earliest layers of Jewish cosmology, particularly those preserved in fragmentary texts at Qumran and hinted in prophetic literature, suggest something more complex. A cosmology where the heavens were not uniformly obedient, where divine beings possessed will, hierarchy, and capacity for discord long before any documented descent to earth. The phrase B'nai Elohim appears in contexts predating the crystallization of Watcher myth. In Job, these beings form a divine court. The Satan stands among them, not yet the adversary of later tradition, but a member whose function involves prosecution and testing. This image of a divine council, populated by celestial beings with distinct roles, forms the cosmological bedrock upon which the Watcher narrative was built. But the council itself implies something crucial: differentiation. And wherever differentiation exists, the possibility of tension follows. Scholars of Second Temple Judaism have noted Persian influence on Jewish angelology during and after Babylonian exile. Zoroastrian cosmology introduced a metaphysical framework foreign to earlier Israelite thought. In Persian tradition, cosmic order was not simply given, it was won. The universe existed in struggle between Asha, principle of truth and order, and Druj, principle of chaos and deception. This dualistic structure seeped into Jewish thought not as wholesale adoption, but as metaphysical vocabulary. Suddenly, the angelic realm could be imagined not merely as obedient servants, but as beings positioned along a spectrum of alignment with divine will. Some maintained station, others wavered, and some fell into something darker than disobedience, into rivalry. In the Book of the Watchers, the earliest section of 1 Enoch, rebellion is described almost as anomaly, sudden, catastrophic breach. But embedded within are hints of older material, references to angelic envy, to celestial beings who observed creation's unfolding and felt something resembling longing, resentment, or desire to partake in dominion. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve fragments of texts never included in canonical Enochic corpus. Fragment 4, Q203, contains references to angelic beings with names absent from later lists. Fragment 4, Q180, describes a cosmic mystery involving spirits of the bastards, offspring of angelic transgression, but frames this as part of larger, older divine drama involving Prince of Lights and Angel of Darkness. What emerges is not a single event, but a cosmology of ongoing tension. A heaven where the question was never if discord would arise, but how it would manifest. The metaphysical problem is straightforward but devastating. Why would beings made in perfect alignment with divine will ever deviate? The answer, encoded in these proto-Watcher traditions, is that perfection and will are incompatible concepts. Will, no matter how luminous its origin, carries capacity for choice. And choice opens the door to deviation. Before Enoch ascended and witnessed the chained Watchers, there existed a cosmological architecture already ancient, a structure of heaven described not in Enoch, but in earlier psalms, prophetic visions, and fragmentary liturgies preserved at Qumran. This structure was hierarchical, graduated, precise. At its apex stood the throne of the Most High, surrounded by fire, guarded by seraphim, whose function was not merely worship, but something closer to containment. These beings, described in Isaiah's vision, possessed 6 wings and cried ceaselessly of holiness. Their role was ontological. They maintained the boundary between finite and infinite, between creation and creator. Below this innermost sanctum existed the divine council, a celestial assembly referenced throughout Hebrew scripture, but rarely elaborated. In Psalm 82, God stands in the divine council and judges among the gods. In 1 Kings, the prophet Micaiah describes Yahweh enthroned with all the host of heaven standing beside him. This council deliberated, advised, and crucially, contained beings with distinct perspectives. These beings were the B'nai Elohim. In the oldest strata of Jewish thought, this term referred not to humanity, but to a class of angelic beings whose function involved cosmic governance. Some were assigned to nations, a concept made explicit in Deuteronomy 32:8, where the Most High divides nations according to the number of the sons of God. Others served as messengers, still others as warriors, executors of judgment, or guardians of cosmic thresholds. But within this structure, something became unstable. The Qumran community preserved texts speaking of divisions within the angelic host, long before the Watcher narrative coalesced. The War Scroll describes an eschatological conflict between sons of light and sons of darkness. But this conflict is presented not merely as future event. It is the culmination of tension woven into creation itself. In this cosmology, the angel of light and angel of darkness are not equal powers, but they are real powers. They command legions, they influence mortal hearts, and they exist in perpetual opposition that will resolve only at end of days. What the War Scroll implies, and earlier fragments suggest more clearly, is that this division did not begin with the Watcher's descent. It began with heaven's structure itself, with the distribution of knowledge, authority, proximity to the divine throne. Heaven was stratified. The higher one's position, the greater one's knowledge of the divine name, of cosmic mysteries, of mechanisms sustaining reality. But knowledge was not evenly distributed. Some angels knew more, some stood closer, some had access to mysteries others could only glimpse. This is where proto-Watcher traditions encode something profound. Before the 200 descended, there were others, angels who questioned their station, who looked upon luminous beings closest to the throne and asked why they themselves could not approach, who gazed upon unfolding creation and wondered why they should remain watchers rather than participants. The Hebrew term ir, watcher, appears in Daniel, referencing angelic beings who descend with decrees. But the root implies more than observation. It suggests guardianship, yes, but also tension inherent in being positioned at a boundary. To stand at a boundary is to see both sides, and to see both sides is to be tempted by crossing. In the cosmology predating Enoch, this temptation was not individual, it was systemic. The architecture of heaven contained within it the conditions for discord. To decode angelic rebellion through Hermetic lens is to abandon the notion that these myths describe literal beings in literal heaven. They describe principles. The rebellion is not historical, it is ontological. In the Corpus Hermeticum, the divine mind, nous, creates through emanation. The one generates the many. Unity fractures into multiplicity, not through flaw, but through necessity of manifestation. For the infinite to express itself, it must become finite. For the one to know itself, it must become the many. But this fracturing is not neutral. Each emanation, each step from the source, involves diminishment. Not moral fall, but metaphysical descent. Lower realms possess less light, less knowledge, less direct access to divine intelligence. The angels in this framework are not servants. They are emanations, layers of consciousness progressively densifying as they move outward from source. The highest angels, seraphim, cherubim, are barely distinguishable from the divine itself. Pure intellect, pure fire, pure alignment. But as one descends through hierarchy, something changes. Beings become more differentiated, more individual, more capable of perspective, of will, of the thought. I am separate from the source. This thought, I am, is the root of rebellion. not because separation is evil, but because separation creates the illusion of autonomy. Lower angelic beings, positioned further from source, begin to experience themselves not as expressions of divine will, but as beings with will. And once will is experienced as separate, desire follows the desire to ascend, the desire to know what higher beings know, the desire to participate in creation rather than observe it. The rebellion, then, is not moral transgression. It is the inevitable consequence of consciousness differentiating itself. The moment an angel becomes sufficiently individuated to think I, it becomes capable of thinking I want. The Hermetic texts describe this process in terms of soul's descent into matter. The soul, originally a spark of divine fire, descends through planetary spheres. At each level, it acquires attributes: desire at Venus, aggression at Mars, structure at Saturn. By the time it reaches material realm, it has forgotten its origin. The angelic rebellion mirrors this descent. But where the soul descends into matter, the angels descend into will. They remain in celestial realms, but they have crossed a threshold of consciousness. They have moved from perfect alignment into the possibility of deviation. And deviation, in a cosmos built on order, appears as chaos, as rebellion, as war. But the war is not between good and evil. It is between different degrees of proximity to source. Angels who remain aligned are not morally superior. They are simply closer, less differentiated. They have not yet asked the question, I am with sufficient force to separate their will from divine will. The fallen angels are those who have crossed that threshold. They have individuated to the point where they can conceive of will distinct from the one. And in conceiving it, they enact it. The myth of celestial conflict appears across the ancient world, each tradition encoding the same metaphysical tension in its own symbolic language. In Persian Zoroastrianism, the cosmos begins not in harmony but in choice. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, exist as twin principles. The cosmos is structured around their opposition, but this opposition is necessary. Asha, truth, order, cosmic law, cannot exist without Druj, deception, chaos, dissolution. Not because Druj is equally powerful, but because the concept of order requires a boundary, requires something to order against. Without resistance, no structure. Without darkness, no definition of light. The Zoroastrian creation describes a time of mixture, when forces of Asha and Druj are intermingled. This is not a fallen state, it is the current state. The state in which choice is possible, in which beings must consciously align themselves with one principle or the other. The angels in this system, the Amesha Spentas, are not passive servants. They are active participants in cosmic struggle. Each governs a domain: good thought, truth, just power. They are principles of cosmic order that must be continuously enacted, continuously defended against counter forces of chaos. This framework illuminates Jewish cosmology of angelic rebellion. The proto-Watcher traditions, exposed to Persian thought during Babylonian exile, absorbed the idea that heaven itself is a realm of struggle. Not because the divine realm is imperfect, but because any cosmos built on structure will inevitably generate tensions among its inhabitants. In Hermetic philosophy, this tension appears differently. The Corpus Hermeticum describes divine mind as perfect, unified, complete. But when it creates the demiurge, the craftsman god shaping material cosmos, something changes. The demiurge possesses intelligence and will, but operates at remove from source. It does not create from perfect knowledge, but from its own understanding, which is necessarily limited. The result is a cosmos that is beautiful but flawed, ordered but containing seeds of disorder, luminous but shot through with shadow. The Hermetic texts do not describe angelic rebellion, but they describe something equivalent: the emergence of beings who govern the cosmos, but do not fully comprehend it, who possess power, but not perfect wisdom, who can shape reality, but also distort it. What the proto-Watcher traditions reveal is this: the ancient world did not imagine heaven as a realm of perfect static obedience. It imagined heaven as a structured cosmos, populated by beings of intelligence and will, arranged in hierarchies of knowledge and proximity to the divine. And it understood that such a structure is inherently unstable, not because the structure is flawed, but because intelligence and will, once granted, cannot be ungranted. A being that can know can also question. A being that can choose can also choose wrongly. A being that stands at a boundary will inevitably be drawn to cross it. The implications are profound. First, it suggests that the cosmos itself, not just material realm, but entirety of existence, is built on tension, on the interplay between order and forces that resist order, between unity and the drive toward differentiation, between divine will and individuated wills of beings who, by virtue of existence itself, possess a degree of autonomy. This is not a tragic vision, it is a dynamic one. The cosmos is not a machine running down, but a living process in which consciousness explores the limits of its own freedom. The angelic rebellions are not aberrations. They are expressions of reality's fundamental structure. Second, it reveals why myths of celestial conflict appear across traditions. The war in heaven is not a Jewish invention borrowed from Persian sources. It is a universal recognition that wherever consciousness becomes differentiated, conflict emerges. Not conflict as violence, necessarily, but as opposition of differing wills, of perspectives that do not align. Higher angels remain in unity because they have not differentiated sufficiently to experience themselves as separate. Lower angels, positioned further from source, have individuated to the point where they can conceive of desires distinct from divine will. Third, it explains the persistence of the myth across millennia. The story of fallen angels endures not because it describes historical events, but because it describes ontological events. Events that occur not once in linear time, but continuously in the structure of consciousness itself. Every moment in which a being moves from instinct to choice, from obedience to will, from unconscious alignment to conscious deviation, that is the fall. That is the rebellion. That is the war in heaven. The ancient texts encode this in mythic form, because myth is the only language capable of conveying realities outside linear causation. The war in heaven did not happen in the past. It is happening now. It happened before Enoch. Because it is not an event, it is the structure of how consciousness unfolds. Before Enoch walked with God and was taken into heaven, there were wars. Not wars of swords and fire, but wars of will. Conflicts among beings made of thought and intention, who inhabited the boundary between infinite and finite, who stood at the threshold and looked in both directions. The Book of Enoch names 200, but the fragments speak of others. Angels whose names were erased. Beings who questioned before questioning had a name. Spirits who fell, not through lust, but through longing. Longing for knowledge, for participation, for a will of their own. The Qumran caves preserved only echoes. Persian traditions encoded it in dualism. Hermetic texts translated it into philosophy. But beneath all layers, the same truth remains. The cosmos is not built on obedience, it is built on tension. On the interplay between unity and separation, between divine will and the wills of beings who have been granted or have taken the capacity to choose. The Watcher's fall was not the beginning of this tension. It was a manifestation, a crystallization, a moment when the ancient unnamed fracture in heaven's architecture became visible, became mythologized, became a story humanity could tell. But the fracture itself is older than any story, older than Enoch, older than the angels' names. It is woven into being itself.